Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are diving straight into a really fascinating and frankly quite dark aspect of the Roman Republic.
We are. We're looking at their system of tax collection, specifically how they outsourced it, and the massive corruption that, well, inevitably followed.
Right, the infamous Publicani, these private companies that basically bought the right to tax entire provinces.
Exactly. The Roman state, for all its administrative might, didn't want the hassle of direct collection in the provinces, so they auctioned it off.
It sounds efficient, almost modern in a way. You get a guaranteed lump sum up front.
It does. These companies, the Societas Publicanorum, they'd bid, pay Rome a huge amount, usually covering a 5-year period, a lustrum. Rome gets its money, nice and clean.
But the catch, and it's a huge catch, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The catch was the incentive. Once that payment was made to Rome, every single coin they collected beyond that amount, that was theirs to keep. Pure profit.
So it wasn't just collecting taxes, it was basically a license to extract as much as humanly possible.
Precisely. It baked extortion, predatory lending, sheer intimidation right into the system's core logic. There was every financial reason to be brutal and none to be fair.
And this wasn't some fringe issue, it was systemic. You see figures like Polybius talking about it quite early on.
Yeah, he mentions it, confirming it wasn't a late Republic problem. It was there for a long time. And later scholars like Neep, they wrote whole books just trying to figure out the structure of these powerful companies.
It's like Rome made a deal, didn't they? Guaranteed cash now.
Traded for long-term instability and, frankly, moral rot in the provinces. Short-term gain, long-term pain, you could say.
Okay, let's unpack this then. That's our mission today. How did this system, maybe born of convenience, become such a massive weakness? How did it fuel unrest, and what does it tell us about, well, the clash between private greed and public good? We'll be looking at Roman law, even drawing some parallels from Athens.
Sounds good. It's a deep rabbit hole.
So let's start with these publicani. They weren't just individuals, right? These were major corporations.
Oh, absolutely. Think big. They were involved in finance, managing public works, resource extraction, not just tax rolls. They were deeply embedded in the state's operations.
Kind of like multinational corporations today, but with actual state authority behind them.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. And because they often had to pay Rome years in advance for taxes they hadn't collected yet, they became major creditors in the provinces. Cicero mentions them chasing debts from a previous lustrum years later.
So they weren't just passing through, they were permanent financial fixtures, lending money, charging interest.
And calling in those debts,
Yeah.
often ruthlessly. They had staying power and the backing of Roman authority.
Which inevitably seems to lead from just aggressive finance to actual crime.
It did. The sources are pretty clear. It wasn't just about charging high interest. They crossed into physical violence, often with the governor either looking the other way or, actively supporting them. The governor needed those taxes collected too, remember?
That incident you mentioned earlier, the investigation in 616 BC, that sounds serious.
It was. The Senate itself ordered an investigation, ex senatus consulto, into murders happening in the Citywald. And the culprits, servants and leaseholders' patchers, connected to pitch extraction.
Pitch. So not even direct tax collection, but resource extraction.
Exactly. The Publicani had contracts for timber, minerals, pitch for the Navy, all sorts of state resources. These weren't just bean counters. They were running resource operations.
So this violence wasn't just, say, roughing up a farmer for unpaid taxes. This was potentially murder linked to getting lumber or pitch out of the ground for Rome.
Right. These leaseholders acted like private security, ensuring the contract yielded maximum profit, even if it meant killing people. The Senate investigation shows the corruption wasn't just financial. It was violent, systemic. Polybius also hints at this darker side, mentioning poisonings and murders connected to these practices.
It really throws that core conflict into sharp relief, doesn't it? Profit versus public function.
Completely. For the Publicani, it was just rational. They made a huge investment up front. Maximizing the return by any means necessary. It was just good business from their perspective.
It almost sounds like that Epicurean idea you mentioned, where virtue is only valuable if it's useful, if it brings pleasure or avoids pain.
It's a striking parallel, isn't it? They reduce the virtue of serving the state to a cold calculation of profit. Their effective virtue was maximizing that profit.
Which must have been deeply disturbing for many Romans and Greeks. You see that suspicion of commerce, right? Like in Athens, looking down on sellers, or farmers in comedies hating having to pay cash.
Yeah, there was a real anxiety about money-making and dependency. The Publicani embodied that anxiety, but amplified it by giving that self-interested figure state power, sometimes even military backing implicitly,
And the results were predictable, I suppose? Resentment? Instability?
eventually leading to outright revolts in some provinces.
Yeah.
But Rome felt stuck. They needed that revenue stream. So instead of ditching the system, they tried to regulate the fallout.
Which meant creating legal tools to go after corrupt officials and presumably the publicani themselves.
Exactly. Special courts were set up, the questions repetendorum, specifically for extortion cases. But the Senate also had a hand in justice, especially early on.
And the Senate could be pretty forceful, even outside the normal laws.
Oh, yes. They sometimes acted based on what they saw as fundamental, almost divine law, the Ancius Gentium, like that case of sex, Marius accused of incest. Throwing it off the Tarpeian Rock wasn't standard procedure. It was tapping into this idea of universal moral law when the public law felt inadequate.
Wait, so if they had to invoke divine law to punish one of their own for a moral crime, does that mean the regular laws were already pretty weak against powerful people like the publicani?
That's a very sharp point. It strongly suggests the everyday legal system was perhaps more geared towards controlling the lower classes than reining in the elite. And this trend only intensified as the Republic fell and the Empire rose.
Ah, right, the shift in trial procedures, the cognitio extra ordinum, that sounds important.
It's fundamental. It basically dismantled the old Republican trial system.
Remind us how that worked again. The old way.
Okay, so traditionally you had a split. The praetor, a magistrate, handled the legal side, he'd say the law, disire. Then a private citizen judge, the idex, would hear the facts and decide the outcome, like a jury.
Separating the law and the facts.
Okay? But cognitio extra ordinum swept that away.
Right.
Now, one single state official or someone they appointed did everything. Heard the case, decided the facts, applied the law, issued the sentence, judge, jury, everything rolled into one.
Wow. That's a massive concentration of power. It sounds less like a trial and more like an administrative decision.
It had that quality, yes. Much more inquisitorial. And the place this power was felt most rawly was out in the provinces.
Because the provincial governor got this power.
Exactly. They held the right to cognoscere. They could conduct a trial entirely by themselves, using pretty much any procedure they deemed fit. This power applied to Roman citizens in their province, but crucially, also to non-citizens, the peregrines.
So let's say I'm a provincial farmer, totally ruined by a tax collector working for the publicani. I somehow managed to bring a case.
You bring it before the governor. But what if that governor is getting kickbacks from those same publicani, or relies on them for funding his own staff or projects, which happened all the time?
Then I'm basically asking the fox to judge the case against the wolves who raided the henhouse.
That's a pretty accurate way to put it. The cognoscere power, combined with the governor's distance from Rome and dependence on local power brokers like the publicani, created a situation where justice was often completely inaccessible for the victims. The legal safety nets were just gone.
And even if a case did somehow make it back to Rome and succeed, the punishment itself was skewed by class, wasn't it?
Massively. This is maybe the most damning part. Roman law explicitly distinguished penalties based on status. You had the honestiores, the elite, the wealthy, senators, equestrians, including successful publicani.
And the humiliores.
The lower status folk. Free artisans, laborers, most provincials, the vast majority.
So what happened to a rich publicanus if found guilty?
For the honestiores, penalties were generally designed to avoid death. The worst was usually deportatio, exile to an island, maybe losing citizenship and property, or relegatio, a less severe exile, maybe getting kicked out of the Senate. Execution. Extremely rare for this class.
So ruin a province through corruption, and your worst case is moving to Rhodes.
Yeah.
With whatever wealth you still have.
Essentially, yes. Their status and wealth were a shield. But for the humiliores, the victims.
A totally different story, I imagine.
Completely. They faced summum supplicium. That's not just death, it's aggravated, horrific death. Being thrown to beasts, crucifixion, burned alive, public terrifying spectacles.
Grief.
Or condemned to the mines, ad metallum, which is basically a slow death sentence. Or forced labor on public works, opus publicum.
What about things like torture? Wasn't that mainly for slaves?
Traditionally, yes, but by the later period, that line blurred. Sources show free men of low status, the humiliores, could absolutely be tortured, especially in provincial investigations. Civic status offered little protection if you weren't wealthy.
So the whole legal system, top to bottom, reinforced the power of the wealthy and the vulnerability of everyone else. It almost seems designed to allow the publicani's behavior.
It certainly didn't do much to stop it, and the penalty structure tacitly endorsed that class hierarchy. Exile for the exploiter, Horrific death for the exploited or those who fought back.
Let's bring Athens into this. You mentioned parallels. How did they handle similar issues of wealth, power, and justice?
Well, Athens prided itself on the rule of law, democracy, equality. But the reality, especially when disputes involved the wealthy, was often quite different. Justice wasn't always swift or even the primary goal.
What do you mean?
Litigation was often seen as just one move in a longer game, a continuing relationship of competition or enmity, as one scholar put it. It wasn't necessarily about immediate redress.
So if someone powerful assaulted you, you wouldn't rush to court.
Not necessarily. You might wait. We see examples in the speeches, like against Simon, where the case was brought 4 years after the assault, or against Conan 2 years later. You waited for the right strategic moment, maybe when your rival was politically vulnerable, to maximize the impact and public shame.
That sounds incredibly frustrating for the victim, but it does point to a key state function, right? Managing conflict.
Absolutely. Even the earliest Athenian laws we know of, Draco's Code from around 621 BC, were largely about stopping private vengeance killings. The state steps in, asserts its authority over disputes like homicide, not necessarily for perfect justice, but to stop endless blood feuds destabilizing the whole community.
Okay, so both Rome and Athens are trying to manage conflict. But in Athens, did wealthy citizens face pressures that might make them act a bit like the Publicani, aggressively pursuing their own interests?
They did, though, in a different way. Wealthy Athenians had significant public financial burdens that most Romans didn't. There was the war tax, the aisphora, which could be very heavy, especially after wars like the Peloponnesian War.
And the liturgies. Tell us about those again.
Right, liturgies were compulsory public sponsorships. You might have to pay to equip a warship for a year, the Triarchia, or fund the chorus for plays at a festival. These could be incredibly expensive, potentially ruinous.
So if the state is constantly demanding huge sums from you, non-recoverable sums,
You might feel, shall we say, highly motivated to make that money back, and maybe more, through your private business dealings. Perhaps lending money at high rates or driving hard bargains in contracts, it creates a pressure point.
similar incentive structure, different mechanism, and could they manage their public image around this?
Very effectively. Athenian democracy valued rhetoric. Wealthy men had, as the sources say, considerable license to portray their public contributions in the best possible light. They can boast about their liturgies, their payment of aisphora, making it very hard for anyone to publicly contradict them or accuse them of hypocrisy if their private dealings were sharp.
So they could build this image of civic virtue, even if behind the scenes they were being quite ruthless financially.
Precisely. It's that disconnect between public image and private action, enabled by wealth and rhetorical skill, something the Publicani also mastered, hiding behind the necessity of state revenue.
Which brings us back to that core question, why did Rome stick with the Publicani system, knowing how corrupt it was?
Fundamentally, it came down to the sheer difficulty of running such a vast empire with ancient technology. Logistics were a nightmare.
Moving grain, money, troops, incredibly slow and inefficient.
Terribly inefficient. Heavy transport was slow, expensive. The Roman state itself, especially under the Republic, just wasn't built to manage massive empire-wide logistics networks directly. When they tried, they often had to resort to forced requisitions of goods and forced labor, which was hugely disruptive and hated, described as cancer on the economy.
So the Publicani stepped into that gap. They offered a solution the state couldn't provide itself.
They did. They provided the capital, the organization, the manpower, the ships sometimes, solving a logistical problem that the relatively small central administration in Rome couldn't handle. It was part of a wider Roman pattern of delegation.
Delegating tax collection to Publicani, delegating massive judicial power to governors.
Exactly. They pushed authority outwards. But the problem is, when you delegate that much power over money and justice to people far away with little direct oversight,
You create the perfect conditions for abuse.
it's the inherent weakness. Look at the power of magistrates like the praetor, shaping law through their edicts, the adicis honorarium. They could offer legal remedies or deny them.
And out in the provinces, the governor was that magistrate, but with even more power and less oversight. A mini-king, almost.
That's a good way to think of it. Miles from Rome, maybe in office for just a year or two, needing to recoup election expenses, relying on local agents like the Publicani for practicalities. The temptation to collude, to use that cognoscere power for personal gain, was immense.
So the whole system ended up relying on the individual moral fiber of the governor or the contractor to resist these massive structural incentives for corruption.
Pretty much. And the legal system, with its bias toward the honestors, provided a safety net if they did get caught. It wasn't just individuals failing, it was a systemic failure of accountability caused by the necessary delegation of power across immense distances. Rome needed these powerful agents but couldn't effectively control them.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Need for revenue leads to privatization. Privatization breeds corruption. Corruption causes unrest. Attempts to control it are hampered by distance and a biased legal system.
Exactly. So the struggle against the Publicani wasn't just about money. It was a fundamental crisis of Roman administration, a clash between the necessities of empire and the principles of justice. It reveals how delegating power without accountability is a recipe for instability.
So as we wrap up, let's leave our listeners with this thought. We talked about the extortion courts, the attempts to bring accountability. But remember, the ultimate penalty for the elite, the honestiors found guilty of ruining provinces, exile deportatio.
Right. So here's the question to ponder. When you contrast that penalty exile with the summum supplicium faced by the lower classes, the humiliores, crucifixion, burning, the beasts, was the Roman legal system genuinely aimed at public justice for all? Or was its primary role actually to maintain the rigid class structure, implicitly protecting the very exploitation that figures like the Publicani thrived on? Did it punish the crime, or just enforce the hierarchy?